it's a little bit like asking your spouse, like, do you love me now? How about now? How about after dinner?
So Rob, thank you so much for taking some time today to talk to me and to shed some light on NPS loyalty. That's, I think, what we're going to talk about today. But before we jump in, so I want to give you a little bit of an icebreaker straight away. What's something that few people would know about you?
Something that few people would know about me. I feel like they know way too much about me already. uh, what would be a fun thing that people wouldn't know about me? I guess maybe people who don't know me well wouldn't know that I really have kind of a love of uh, learning Spanish, and
Really?
so I I tend to watch a lot of Spanish language TV since I don't have too many options for speaking on a day to day basis. And for a long time, I don't do it as much anymore, but for a long time, I was reading novels that were originally written in English, but translated into Spanish because it was actually a great way to expand my vocabulary.
Yeah, cool. Nice. That's interesting. So, yeah, like I said, we are really curious about where we can go on NPS especially. But looking back, it was a metric that or a system that was developed by Fred Reichfeld, who is also part of Bain and Company. What was the problem or the pain that he was aiming to solve?
Well, originally, the idea was that we wanted to create a metric that would balance against the P&L and the balance statement, balance sheet. And the idea was that businesses are dominated by short-term focus on earnings and revenue, and often that comes at the expense of customers. And so we wanted to create something that would help leadership teams feel accountable to improving relationships with customers. In the late 80s, early 90s, we started with customer retention. During the 90s, we moved to a loyalty acid test, is what we were calling it then, which was a multi question index that was predictive of customer lifetime value. And the way that the net promoter score came about was um, really based on a discussion that Fred had with Enterprise Rent-A-Car's CEO and leadership team, where they convinced him that the sophistication and the accuracy of a multi-question metric really was inferior to the simplicity of a less accurate single question based metric. At Enterprise, they were using what they called the Enterprise Service Quality Index. And it was really just a form of a satisfaction question.
Mhm.
But what they had found was that by simplifying it to a single question and focusing people in the organization on improving that, they had motivated action as opposed to analysis. And I think Fred became enamored of that. I personally was a skeptic, honestly, but he demonstrated that you could get a significant portion of the uh, value that you get from a multi-question index out of a single question
Mhm.
by testing a whole bunch of different questions and figuring out which ones had the highest predictive power for the drivers of customer lifetime value and comparing those to the other things that we were doing. And so it really, what it solved, back to your question, was the gap between knowing that you needed to improve your customer loyalty, or knowing what the drivers of customer loyalty were and acting on that.
Yeah.
And I think that's what made it so powerful over the 20 or so years since we first developed it.
And also simplifying, because if you have to go, force people to answer 20 questions versus one simple, how likely are you to recommend, right? Brand X and just give a score 1 to 10. That's super powerful that it's so simple. And if it's proven to be predictive, then I guess that was the whole Bain.
Yeah, I mean, we were able to show that it was for sure predictive enough.
Yeah.
And importantly, that simplicity that you're talking about was what helped unlock action.
Yeah. Cool. So over the years, it obviously evolved, and the framework at Bain, I think it's called NPS Prism, right? And it allows you to unlock some more deeper insights. Can you explain a little bit how that works?
NPS Prism is a benchmarking service that we developed a few years ago. And it is important to benchmark yourself against your competitors in terms of the relationships you have with customers, because you can improve your net promoter score or whatever other customer loyalty metric you have. But if you're not improving it as fast as your competitors are, you can lose market share.
Yeah.
It's what we call satisfactory underperformance. It's, we're getting better. We're just not getting better fast enough.
Yeah.
So competitive benchmark solves that problem by helping you understand the context in which your customers are making decisions and how they compare you to competitors. Now, what we found was that we were doing expensive benchmarking surveys for a series of our clients in the same industry, back to back to back. But because of the nature of our consulting relationships, we're not allowed to use the data that and the analytics that we developed for one client for another.
Mm-hmm.
So we'd have one client paying us to do almost exactly the same thing we had another client paying us to do. Both of them were overspending what they should be to get really good insights. And so when we talked to them, we said, hey, what if you could get the same kind of insights based on essentially a syndicated piece of research? And you could do that on a continuous basis for a fraction of what you're paying us today, or what you're doing if you continue it yourself, doing solo. The downside would be that it would be available to your competitors as well for the same price. You should just know that many of your competitors are already, paying to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And they were surprisingly enthusiastic about that. They wanted those insights, and most of them knew that their competitors were going to get that insight one way or another. Why not get it for less?
Yeah.
So that's what NPS Prism is. And what's unique about it is that it's based on 20 years of our experience doing this benchmarking, where we've been able to figure out in most industries how to benchmark all the way down to individual customer episodes or journeys in a way that allows you to gain real insight about which journeys matter most, where you stand relative to your competitors on those journeys, and what about them you're doing especially well or especially poorly. It's a depth of insight that I don't think you can get any other way.
Yeah. Wow, that's very powerful. Cool. Rob, in a recent podcast with Fred Reichfeld, you both were talking about those who claim that NPS is dead are actually victims of NPS misuse. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there's two categories of people who claim that NPS is dead. One category are people who never wanted to see NPS get any traction in the first place. Often they have an interest in something. They have a financial interest in some alternative or something like that.
Yeah.
Not always the case, but often. The second are a group of people who either unwittingly or in some cases, maybe with a little bit of intentionality, are misusing Net Promoter in some significant way. So, what are the kind of straw man things, the misuses that I see held up as if they were the reality of everyone. One would be, companies that only seek feedback from people who are going to give them high scores.
Yeah.
That's not really very useful. It results in vanity metrics. Another would be people who don't gather enough information, meaning they just get a score and they don't do anything in terms of digging into why, what the drivers are, further analytics that would enable you to really understand what you should do about it. A third would be people who oversurvey. And this is a really common issue. The Net Promoter Score is a relationship score. Likelihood to recommend is a relationship question. We use it in very specific circumstances also to help give us indications of the impact of different journeys or important episodes in a customer's experience with a company. But we don't use it at every touch point all the time. It's just not, it doesn't make any sense.
No.
I have a friend who used to say, it's a little bit like asking your spouse, like, do you love me now? How about now? How about after dinner?
Yeah.
It's just like, you can't, nobody can respond well to that. And it results in things that are just not useful.
So if we apply that to, let's say, an e-commerce business who delivers something at home, you've got your online process, you've got your waiting time, you've got your arrival. I guess we want to wait until after arrival, but maybe not immediately after. What would be good practice?
Well, I think the way to think about it is, in Bain terminology, an episode begins at the moment that a customer first knows that they have a need, and ends when they know that that need has been fulfilled.
Right.
So in your example, I might, depending on the nature of the situation, I might really want to wait until the customer has received their package. Or I might want to wait until they've had time to use it, set it up and use it. Or I might want to wait until they've been using it for a while and they have a perspective on what it's like. It depends on what you're trying to learn. But what I know I don't want is an incomplete need satisfaction. So, I placed the order. I don't think that's a place to ask about likelihood to recommend. I placed the order might be a time to ask about how hard it was or easy, or about how satisfactory, or the extent to which you were able to find the products you wanted, or they were in stock, or you're happy about the expected delivery date. If you need to ask, I put a high threshold on bothering a customer
Exactly
with a survey.
Yeah. Okay, that's good advice. So, NPS as a metric, is it, according to you, a driver or an outcome of customer loyalty? So is it because of a good net promoter score, you're being a promoter, that you will actually end up being loyal? Or is it just something that we can measure once we have the behavioral loyalty established?
I'd rather call it an indicator, Simon. It's not an outcome in and of itself. It's an indicator. It's a customer's indication of the strength of the relationship between them and the company or the product or service. An outcome would be potentially repeat purchase, price realization, retention, expansion of a relationship. Those are outcomes. The issue with those, and it's a minor issue in some ways and a major one in others, the issue is that those take time to play out. So the indication you get from likelihood to recommend at a particular moment in time is a pretty good forward-looking predictor of those outcomes at the individual customer level and at the group of customer level.
So if we see a statistically significant drop in NPS, we can expect that to backfire relatively soon.
Well, again, in relative terms, so in relationship to likelihood to recommend competing or alternative products and services, if you see a drop relative to those others, you would, all things being equal, expect to see a drop in market share, or in revenue growth relative to competitors, or in profitability, perhaps.
Share of wallet, or any of those metrics.
That's right. I'm being very specific with my language, and I apologize for being a little bit nitpicky, but I think that part of the, you asked about the critics and the doubters. I think part of it is by being imprecise about what they are measuring and why, they find it easy to criticize. And it's often just a misunderstanding of what it is that a company using it well is using it for.
Cool. Rob, I want to talk about business transformations, which is something that Bain is always a lot involved to. And in your bio, we read that you've led some of the world's most dramatic customer experience transformations. Would be cool to know your all-time favorite.
Well, we're reluctant to talk about our clients, in part because we don't like to take credit for the hard work that they do.
Right.
So what I can tell you in maybe a more productive way is some of the companies that I admire, whose long-term transformations I admire. One that I've written a lot about over the years is Telstra, which is the Australian phone company that was a little bit like, it was the state phone company in Australia, was privatized, had a horrible reputation with customers, really bad. And when David Thodey was named CEO on his first day, he said to his colleagues, he said to investors, he said, "I am all about the customer. We are going to make ourselves a beloved company here." And they really did. They went from deeply negative NPS. They went from a time when employees were embarrassed to say that they worked for Telstra to really a strong set of relationships with their customers over I guess it was probably a 7 or 8 year period of very hard work. And we documented this in a set of articles, and there's some videos you can find if you're really interested in the story. But I think that's one of the really remarkable ones. I think Lego is a tremendous story because they had lost their way. They're a wonderful company with a tremendous legacy, but they had lost their way. They'd become very focused on growth and profitability, and they got themselves into strategic trouble and trouble with their customers. And then they reset, and they used Net Promoter as part of the story. They used a whole bunch of other tactics and strategies to get themselves back on track. We've written a lot about how T-Mobile went from a kind of also ran in mobile telephone in the US to becoming, the Un-carrier and really having a leading position in loyalty with their customers. It was a tremendous turnaround. They might have gone out of business if they hadn't fixed it. So there are a lot of really, really fascinating stories of companies that have either been loyalty leaders and lost their way and come back, or who needed to figure it out for the first time. And I think a lot of the tools, techniques, capabilities that they put in place are the kinds of things that, we do with our clients and we write a lot about.
Great examples. And obviously, Lego is a brand that, already has an emotional connection with consumers. I just bought a few sets for my children. They love it. And, I used to play it, my parents even. So it's a intercultural, intergenerational brand. But the T-Mobiles of the world, the Telstra, they have a different position. They're service providers. They don't have that emotional connection by default, I mean. So how important is it, according to you, to create that emotional connection? There's so many people talking about emotional loyalty and the importance of that in achieving loyalty. What's your take on that?
Well, first, I think it's important to define loyalty. Loyalty, in my mind, is a high standard. Um, I don't think of there are things that people talk about as habit, or even they'll talk about behavioral loyalty and talk about that as loyalty. For me, loyalty is grounded in an emotional connection. Really truly loyal customers want a company to be successful. They desire the success of that company, and they want to share the good things that they get from their relationship with that company with friends and family members, people they care about. That's loyalty. They give permission to a company they're loyal to serve more needs than they did, at the very beginning. They um, they accept a little bit of imperfection from those companies, and they're forgiving of the occasional issue or error or mistake. So, repeat purchase, habit, those are tenuous unless they're backed up by an emotional connection. As a result, it can be hard for companies in certain industries to earn deep loyalty. If you don't have a category that you're in that naturally connects people in an emotional way, then you've got to find other ways to enrich the lives of your customers so that they develop that emotional connection. I have a client that makes cement and chemicals. These are commodities. They're sold B2B. You would think, what could be less emotional than cement?
True.
But it turns out if you're in the construction industry, there are real differences in not just the chemical composition and the performance of different kinds of cement or concrete, but also, and importantly, in how it gets delivered, how they deal with changes in production schedule. It rains. And sometimes when it rains so hard that you can't accept a shipment of cement. Well, how does that company deal with that? And what happens if you have a sudden and unexpected need for a significant volume? Things like that are the elements of a commodity business relationship that can, under the right circumstances, earn the emotional loyalty of a customer, even in circumstances that don't seem on their face like they might lend themselves to that.
Moments that matter for
Moments that matter. That
specific
is
customer
that
journeys.
is that is the consulting buzzword that we.
Yeah. Cool. Rob, in the interest of time, I think we already have to round off this very pleasant conversation. Thank you so much for shedding your light on the very important topic of NPS. It was truly a pleasure.
It's my pleasure, Simon.
Thanks.